known as the land of opportunity, but deep-rooted unfairness has caused an imbalance. In America, it is considered taboo to divert from societal norms. And there are many examples of this, such as Colin Kaepernick, who takes a knee during the national anthem, and he's getting a lot of backlash for not being patriotic. And the Black Lives Matter, if you guys didn't know, they're considering it an extremist group, which is crazy. It is like we want to turn a blind eye to all the injustices that go on in our country, such as the increased killings of unarmed Black men. Another injustice that we should change is the mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders. I'm an African American female who lives in Brooklyn, New York. Although this issue does not directly impact me, it is still unjust. The federal government should end mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders because police and quotas discriminate against people of color, the war on drugs discriminate against people of color, and extensive time in jail creates barriers to employment and stability. Where this stems from is slavery. During slavery, blacks were inferior to whites, and this still remains in our society today. Although laws have gone into effect, the stigma has not changed. Because of this stigma, many people expect black men specifically, to commit crimes, and that is why there's so many issues with stop and frisk, and it's like the main issue of why so many unarmed Black men are getting killed. Police departments have engaged in stop and frisk of people who are walking, people who are poor, and people of color. They also have to meet quotas, which means that they have a goal. Some people say that this is a myth, but Julio Diaz, New York chapter president of the Latino Officers Association, said, "I can tell you, I'm a police officer. There are quotas in the NYPD." The 10 officers who spoke to the I-Team are plaintiffs along with 2 other officers in a federal class action suit that claims that NYPD is continuing to pursue illegal quotas and is punishing officers who do not meet numerical goals. Along with these quotas, prisons have a minimum population that they want to have during a period of time. And another quote says, "After 3 violent inmates escaped from an Arizona private prison, state corrections officials demanded improvements and stopped sending new inmates to what they call a dysfunctional 3,300-bed facility. Less than a year later, the company that runs the prison, management and training court, threatened to sue the state. A line in their contract guaranteed that the prison would remain 97% full, and they argued that they lost nearly $10 million from the reduced inmate population." So the focus is mainly on prisons, filling the beds of prisons, and not on sentence reform. So with the focus being on that, the focus is basically a business, so it's trying to get revenue. So many states are obligated to continue to incarcerate people regardless of crime rates and public safety needs. So people of color make up 30% of the population, and 60% of those people are incarcerated. So 1 in every 15 African American and 1 in every 36 Hispanic Americans are incarcerated in comparison to 1 in every 106 white men. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 1 in 3 Black men can expect to go to jail in their lifetime. Another reason the federal government should end mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders is that the war on drugs target people of color. Half of the arrests that occur today are for drugs, and half of these are for marijuana. Despite the fact that Black and whites use marijuana at the same rates, the ACLU found a Black person is 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana than a white person. Despite the facts that whites engage in drug offenses at higher rates than Black do, Blacks are incarcerated for drug offenses at 10 times greater than whites. During the 1980s, the cocaine use was high, and possession of powder cocaine and crack cocaine had different sentencing. Crack was used as a scapegoat for social problems in inner cities, such as unemployment, poor education, lack of resources, and violence. It was easy to blame drugs for inner city problems. Crack use was a symptom of poverty and social economic disparity, while cocaine use was glamorized as a white party drug. According to legislative history, Congress had concluded that crack cocaine was more dangerous than powdered cocaine, and that this conclusion drove its decision to treat crack cocaine differently from powdered cocaine. So crack cocaine is basically powdered cocaine. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's basically cut with baking soda and water. So crack cocaine is less potent than powdered cocaine. So it wouldn't make sense to me that powdered cocaine would have less harsh sentences than crack cocaine if it's having a more crazy effect. And as a result of these harsher sentences and being locked up for such a long period of time, when released, barriers to employment and stability are formed. Simple possession of drugs can result in a person serving life without parole. In an article, Former Inmates About Life After Jail, when I was in prison on a nonviolent drug offense, all I could think about was getting out. Even though I had a life sentence without parole, I worked hard to learn welding and cooking skills that I was sure to help me find a job to support myself if I were ever released. I imagined that I could have a chance to build my new life, and after I'd spent 16 years behind bars, my dream came true. President Obama commuted my sentence. So when he got out of jail, he thought he could use these skills that he gained from jail, but that wasn't the case. He went out for a job interview, and the interviewer asked him if he had any criminal history, and he said, yes, I went to jail for drugs. And the interviewer basically shrugged it off like, oh, we all go to jail for drugs. But he then went into detail that he spent 16 years, and the interviewer basically dumped him. All right, and the next article is Stephanie George, who was sentenced to life in prison in a drug case. She said she was confused by Facebook, that she set up 5 different accounts, not realizing that she was creating an entirely new page each time and not just signing in. And Norman Brown, whose life sentence was commuted last summer, joked that he was used to cell phones as big computers when he was first arrested. Ryan Wintersmith, who was sentenced to life in prison on crack charge when he was still a teenager, he said he was still amazed to see how many people were staring at their smartphones on the street. You know how much you're missing. So this basically speaks volumes that these crazy sentences, and after being released, it's hard to adjust to the new technological improvements and just basically finding work. So some progress has been attempted, but when Barack Obama granted early release, like I said, to some federal drug offenders, but more can be done, such as criminal justice reform that targets war on drugs, and generally being softer on crime and not having a mandatory minimum for populations for prisons, and removing incentives and quotas. In conclusion, police discriminate by programs such as stop and frisk, quotas which make justice into business, and war on drugs targets people of color by having stricter sentences for drugs that are primarily used by people of color. And extensive time in jail creates barriers. Therefore, the federal government should end mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders. I also have a video. You don't have to. It was a good video.